Welcome to Jewish History Soundbites podcast with Yehuda Geberer. Immerse yourself in the rich tapestry of Jewish history as we explore fascinating tales and uncover hidden gems from our glorious past. Brought to you by our proud sponsor, Cross River, a leader at the intersection of financial services and technology, committed to empowering the communities they serve. Cross River's steadfast support fuels our mission to preserve our heritage and foster a vibrant future for all. Contact Cross River through their website at crossriver.com.
A date which will live in infamy.
Both
of those projects, initiatives, got off the ground because of the Ger Rebbe.
The 11 Olympic team members slain in West Germany. The Olympic Games.
Zugerecht waren Brüder in Amerika. Schon Shabbos at the Skitzal.
Out of the 24 who were killed were Americans who had come to learn in Hebron.
I say 1 million Jewish children who were made to be cut loose.
Whoever heard such beautiful words?
It is never too little, it is never too late, and it is never enough.
Jewish History Soundbites, bringing alive the world of our glorious past. Here is our host, live from Jerusalem,
Yehuda Geberer with Jewish History Soundbites, and this episode is going to be about the Shtefanesht Chassidic dynasty, and specifically about the Tzadik of Shtefanesht of Avraham Matisyahu Friedman, in honor of the recent yahrzeit. It was a couple of days ago. It was supposed to be on time. Is it a problem that it's late? I don't think so, personally. I hope no one else is bothered by that minor detail as well. It was his 91st yahrzeit, just 2 days ago, Chaf Aleph Tammuz. And I've been wanting to speak about Shtefanesht for a while, and there's an anonymous listener who really, he inspired me to do it now for the yahrzeit. He kept on pushing me, didn't give up, even when I was late. And he told me he just wants to spread the light and the name of the Rebbe and his yeshiyas, because there was no one like the Shtefaneshter when it came to yeshiyas, getting miraculous salvation for all kinds of things. And therefore, this episode is B'schus the Rebbe of Avraham Matisyahu ben Reb Menachem Nuchem, Avraham Matisyahu ben Reb Menachem Nuchem Schism Yugain Ulaini. That was pretty good. Either way, now when I first got exposed to this was when I first moved to Israel about 25 or so years ago. I first moved here. I'd never heard of Shtefanesht, and I was here. I was in like this Litvish yeshiva, and the guys there, not Hasidim, they were saying how they're going to Shtefanesht and the food there is good, and the yahrzeit, and it's a matzav, and everyone goes, and you have to go, and like it was this reference point. It was like this cultural activity that even young teenagers were involved in, and I was like, what in the world is this Shtefanesht? So right away, I started looking into it then, 25 years ago, because I was so curious. In America, I had never heard of it. And here, everyone seemed to know about it. He's buried in Givatayim, in the Nachlat Yitzchak cemetery here in Givatayim, because he's reburied. Originally, he was buried in Romania. And he's kind of like the OG Segula. He's the original Segula. Before there was Karastir and before there was anything else, Shtefanesht Chaf Aleph Tammuz in Tel Aviv. In Givatayim, that was the place to go to. That's where they originally had it. This was the matziv. And it was all like Israelis. Americans didn't hear of him so much, at least as far as I knew in my circles. Maybe in other circles they did. So why didn't Americans hear of him so much? I don't know. It's a little surprising because the Ribnitzer Rebbe, who everyone's into in America, was a close Talmud or follower or chassid of the Shtefaneshter. And he is very popular. So He should be, the Shtefanesht should be more popular, and everyone should hear of him, the Shtefanesht Tzadik, or Avraham Matisyahu Friedman, and the great Segula and all the yeshiyas that come from davening there by him. In fact, I do groups in Nachlat Yitzchak. I wish I could go there more often. It's a fascinating historical cemetery with a lot of memorials and a lot of tzaddikim and rabbanim, and Shtefanesht, of course, is the main attraction there, and there's always people davening there and everything. People of all stripes, by the way. It's fascinating to see them. Secular and religious, Ashkenazim, Sfardim, Hasidim, not Hasidim. There's always people there by the Shtefanesht or Nachlat Yitzchak, but we do a whole tour of the cemetery. It's very interesting. I was recently there with a small elite group, among them my good friend Davi Safir, but we stopped by the Shtefanesht there, but we should go more often. It's a great cemetery to go to for those who are into that kind of thing. So what is Shtefanesht? Where does it come from? What are we talking about? I keep on saying it's so famous, big yeshiyas, big skulas, and they did hear of him, they didn't hear of him. What in the world does it come from? So the Shtefanesht is a branch of the Ruzhin Sadiger dynasty. We have, of course, the yichus from the Maggid of Mezrich, Reb Dov Ber, the Maggid of Mezrich, who is a close student of the Baal Shem Tov HaKadosh himself, the beginning of Hasidus, and the Maggid was probably the most influential of all the Talmidei Baal Shem Tov. The Maggid's son was a big tzaddik named Avraham, who is known as Avraham HaMalach. He was known as the Malach, an angel, because he was so holy. His son was Rav Shalom Shachna, and his son was Rabbi Yisrael Friedman of Ruzhin, the Heilige Ruzhiner. That's how he's referred to in Hasidic history. So the Heilige Ruzhiner had 10 children, 6 sons and 4 daughters. The 4th son, who was the 6th child altogether, 2 girls before him as well, was Reb Menachem Nochem Friedman. And he is named, of course, for his illustrious ancestor, Reb Menachem Nochem of Chernobyl, the Ma'arei Naim. And there's a lot of Friedman, Tursky, in other words, Ruzhin, Chernobyl, multiple connections. These are the 2 great Ukrainian Hasidic dynasties with multiple branches across Ukraine, and therefore they intermarried many times over the generations. So this is just one of them. So quick background: Rabbi Yisrael Friedman of Ruzhin, the Heilige Ruzhiner, he established his court in the town of Ruzhin in Ukraine, and which was, of course, in Russia at that time. Might be in Russia again soon, for all we know, but it definitely was in Russia at that time in the 19th century we're talking about. And the Ruzhiner was framed for a crime by the Tsarist police, which he was not guilty of, and he was jailed in Tsarist Russia. Following his release in 1842, he escaped from Russia. He escapes across the border to Austria to get away from the Tsar and his police and the whole situation there, which is a whole story. Maybe we should get to that one day also. And he settles in Sadiger, in Austrian Bukovina. And upon his passing, the Ruzhiner's passing in 1850, all of his sons emerged as Hasidic leaders with their own dynasties, with vast influence, huge impact on Hasidic and Jewish society. Some of the branches I'll mention: Sadiger, one generation later, Bayan also comes from it. There's also Chortkiv, Husyatin, Bohush, later a bunch more. Kapushnitz also comes from it eventually, and a few more, less famous ones. Vasily, Pashkan, there's plenty of others. So Shtefanesht is simply one of these branches. Some of the Ruzhin Sadiger dynasties were in Galicia, others were in Romania. All of these branches of Ruzhin Sadiger, they followed the approach of the Ruzhiner, which was the Derech HaMalchus, the regal way, which was a regal court. The Rebbes, the Tzaddikim, were the aristocracy of the Jewish people, and they were looked up to as the aristocracy, and they lived as such. This was the Avodah, this was the Malchus of the expression of Malchus, that Tzaddik is a Melech, a royalty, and they had these huge courts and huge homes and in a huge base medrash, and it was an aliyah l'regel. When you went, there were pilgrimage to the Rebbe. It was a whole, very, very uplifting situation, because the physical manifestation of the regal way was a very impressive, very impressive court. Also, when the Rebbe traveled, when the tzaddikim traveled, they had chariots and horses and servants and attendants and a whole entourage. That was the regal way. So Shtefanesht followed that also. So the Nachum Friedman, this fourth son of the Ruzhin, he moves to Romania, Moldova, whatever it is. There's quite a large Jewish community in Romania, but further south in Romania, there was actually a Sephardic community. We're talking about in northern Romania or Moldova, that area, and it was a relatively new Jewish community. Ashkenazi Jews had only settled there recently, so it did not have a lot of prestige or rabbinical authority or Hasidus. The Hasidic communities there were very new, so this was a fertile ground for new areas of influence. And they come to the town of Shtefanesht. Nachum settles in Shtefanesht, which is sort of Romania, or maybe it's northern Moldova, depends who you ask. Today it's in Romania, in any event. It's on the banks of the Prut River, and it's on the border with Bessarabia, which is another district. So he settled there in 1852, which is after his father's passing, and he emerges as a great Hasidic leader. So Rabbi Nachum settled in Shtefanesht. Mid-19th century Romania was not very developed in its Jewish community altogether, definitely not in Hasidus. So the children of the Ruzhin who settled there, and Rabbi Nachum was only one of several of the children of the Ruzhin who settled there, they established a Hasidic presence for the first time. And they were pretty much the first ones to do so. So Shtefanesht soon emerged as a large center of Hasidic life. Rabbi Nachum was very reserved. He did not say any Torah at his table to his followers, which was, interestingly enough, rather common within Ruzhin circles. Very little is known about him in general. In his regal court, he had a Mashiach room with expensive clothing and a golden crown, for the time of when Mashiach arrived. He had a lot of mysterious behavior. He used to relate stories, often humorous ones, that were said to contain hidden mystical messages. He also would relate simple anecdotes about everyday life, which were also said to have subliminal meaning. Despite all this, his leadership was very strong. His followers bid his calling, very much on top of the goings-on in the various communities across the region in the area of Moldova, Romania, where he had followers. He had a very strong leadership in a very silent way, and sometimes mysterious fashion. In fact, there was a very interesting story I bumped into, and I actually lectured on this when I was in Morocco, and I discussed the Avraham HaKadosh. There was a Melamed, a school teacher from the town of Sivin in Moldova, who had stated that the Avraham HaKadosh, Reb Chaim Ibn Attar, who authored the famous Moroccan commentator on the Chumash, so he has said that he had authored his commentary on Chumash through hard work in achieving Torah excellence. That's how the Avraham had written his commentary. So what was wrong with that? Because the Melamed said that it was not through divine inspiration. It was not written through Ruach HaKodesh. It was written because the Avraham toiled and worked hard, and that's how he came up with this commentary. So the Jewish community in this town of Sivin in Moldova was primarily composed of Shtefanesht Chassidim, and under the direction of their Rebbe, Rabbi Nachum, they basically waged war against this Melamed, Cherem, and all the works. Why? Because this was considered disparaging remarks regarding the Avraham HaKadosh, that he didn't have Ruach HaKodesh. He wrote it just as anyone could write it. It was just his intellect. God forbid, it has to be that it was Ruach HaKodesh. So this Melamed then turned for assistance to Reb Chaim Halberstam, the Divrei Chaim of Tzanz. Now this is in the 1860s. This is prior to 1869, which is the year that the Divrei Chaim opened his dispute. He basically declared war on all the Ruzhin Sadiger branches, which is a different story. But here the Shtefanesht and the Divrei Chaim are allowed to be on the same side of the story because this is prior to that. In any event, the Divrei Chaim wrote a landmark halachic response on the topic of Ruach HaKodesh in general. It's still cited till this very day. I've delivered lectures on the topic of Ruach HaKodesh and history of Ruach HaKodesh, not the halachas of Ruach HaKodesh, which I've used this historic halachic response of the Divrei Chaim as the benchmark. Essentially, the Divrei Chaim sided with Rabbi Nachum of Shtefanesht. He also said that they can't take away the parnasa of the Malamed. They have to still keep on supporting him. But anyway, that's a side story. Rabbi Nachum Friedman, the first Shtefanesht Rebbe, passed away at a relatively young age in his mid-40s after serving as a prominent Chassidic leader for about 18 years following his father's passing. His passing in 1868 was actually a big blow for the family because he was a beloved brother among his family, the children of the Ruzhiner. In fact, his brother Dov Ber Friedman, or of Liova, or Berniu, he later stated that his brother's passing is what pushed him over the edge, because this Berniu Friedman had a whole tragic story with him. He left his position as Hasidic leader in Liova, and he essentially left Yiddishkeit entirely, which is a crazy story, one of the craziest stories in the history of Hasidus. The son of the Ruzhiner, who was a Rebbe, and basically went off the derech. He left Yiddishkeit. Whether he did come back or didn't come back, and what that whole story was, we'll hopefully save for another time, maybe after all my kids are married. But in any event, I'm just bringing out this story now to show you how beloved Rabbi Nachum was, that this was kind of like the last straw for his brother when he went into his full depression. Rabbi Nachum of Shtefanesht had two daughters, both of whom married cousins, one into the Bahush dynasty, which we'll get back to later, and one of the Sadiger Rebbes in that branch also. The Rabbi Nachum also had one son, and that son is the one who succeeded him and is the primary story here. Rabbi Avraham Matisyahu Friedman of Shtefanesht, the one whose yahrzeit was just 2 days ago and who has been reburied in Givatayim in the Nachlat Yitzchak Cemetery near Tel Aviv. Rabbi Nachum passed away in Yassi in Romania and is buried there until today. So I've never been, but many travel there to his kever. It's a nice visit. I hope some groups start requesting Romania, and we can start doing Romania itineraries. There's plenty to see there, and we definitely should go to Yassi to have some fun going to these places and to the first Shtefanesht Rebbe. But now let's move on to his son, who was the more famous Shtefanesht Rebbe, the second and last Shtefanesht Rebbe. Rav Avraham Matisyahu, known as the Shtefanesht Rebbe, born in 1848, and he passed away in 1933. Nice long life. When he was born, his illustrious grandfather, the Ruzhiner, Rav Yisrael Friedman, the Heilige Ruzhiner, was still alive. He passed away in 1850, so he was about 2.5, 3 years old when his grandfather passed away. And the Ruzhiner, instructed his son, Rabbi Nachum, to name his son Avraham, first of all for his ancestor Avraham HaMalach, and Matisyahu for Hanukkah, because he was born on Hanukkah. So Matisyahu is in honor of Matisyahu of Hanukkah fame. So he's Avraham Matisyahu. When he was somewhere around 2-something years old, shortly before his grandfather passed away, the Ruzhiner taught his grandson the Aleph Beis. He had him on his knee. He held him on his knee, and he taught him the Aleph Beis. He went and had him repeat Aleph Beis Gimel, and when they got up to Yud, so in that part of the world, in Galicia, Ukraine, whatever it was, the way they pronounce it is not Yud, they pronounce it as Yid, which also means Jew. A Yid is a Jew. So the pronunciation, it was Yid. So he said, repeat this letter is Yid. And then he pointed to his grandson and said, Du bist a Yid, or Di bist a Yid, you're a Yid. That's what you are. You see, I've made you into a Guter Yid. And a Guter Yid is a common way of referring to someone who's a Rebbe, or a Hasidic Tzadik, or a Hasidic leader, is sometimes referred to as a Gitter Yid, a good Jew. So his grandfather was predicting that not only is he a Yid, of course he was, but he's also going to be a big tzaddik and a big rebbe one day. So the Shtefaneshter grew up in Shtefanesht, obviously, following his parents' move there after his grandfather's passing. When he grew up, his first marriage was to a descendant of the Rupshitz Galician dynasty in Rupshitz. This was again long prior before the Sons Sadiger dispute. There's probably a marriage like this wouldn't have happened after the Sons Sadiger dispute in 1869. Rupshitz was obviously on the Sons side of the story, but this was before that. So he marries a Rupshitzer Einikel, and but that marriage did not work out. They got divorced. The divorce took place in 1883. It was actually quite a messy divorce. It ended up in the non-Jewish courts for a settlement, which is quite rare for that time. And it seems that it was related to the fact that they didn't have children. That might have been part of the story there, which makes sense at that time and society in that context. That might have been part of the grounds for divorce, or at least to have the marriage sour. His second marriage, shortly afterwards, was to his cousin. This way you keep it in the family, which is also quite common in those circles. But in his second marriage, they never had any children either. He never had children. Right away, shortly after he got married as a young teenager, when his father was still alive. Rav Avraham Matisyahu attended a very big Rebbeisha wedding in Rachamistrivka, another branch of the Chernobyl dynasty. And the Shtefaneshter, all of his uncles and all these great tzaddikim, sons, his uncles were sons of the Ruzhin, and all these other great tzaddikim of Chernobyl were there. So he wanted to seek out their blessing that he should merit to have children. So he was pushing through the crowds to get to his uncles and the other tzaddikim who were in attendance. He was quite young at this time because his father was still alive. His father passed away when he was 21 years old, so it had to be before he was 21. But he got married as a young teenager, which was also common in those circles. And his father, who was at the wedding, saw him trying to get in, who was trying to push his way in. So he called out into the crowd, "Allow this kadosh, allow this holy person through." And everyone turned their heads. Who's the Shtefanesht Rebbe calling a kadosh? Who are they calling a holy person? And Rabbi Aaron Tversky of Chernobyl was one of those in attendance. And he said, "One second, this young fellow, this young teenager is a kadosh. He's a holy person." He took a long look at him, and then he said, "Your father's right. You are a kadosh," which is amazing that they're able to, just look at his face and see that this was someone extremely holy. He was always, even as a young, in his father's court, Rav Matisyahu was always beloved among his father's Chassidim. He was well liked. He was very warm. His father referred to him as the Adam HaShalem, a complete human being, a complete servant of Hashem, a complete someone his avodah was complete. And then when he was 21, his father passed away rather young. This is 1868. Initially, Rabbi Avraham Matisyahu refused to assume the mantle of leadership. He felt he was too young, but he eventually relented. There's a story involving a visit to his uncle, Rabbi Avraham Yaakov Friedman of Sadiger, son of the Ruzhiner. And this led to his accepting the mantle of leadership of Shtefanesht. He visited his uncle shortly after his father's passing. The two of them sat facing each other for half an hour without exchanging one word. Finally, when he left, the Sadiger Rebbe said, "He's the next Shtefanesht Rebbe. He's going to succeed his father now." And his nephew, Rav Avraham Matisyahu, accepted. The Sadiger Rebbe explained that it says in the Navi, "Chachmas Shloima Ta'ir Panav." The wisdom of Shloima HaMelech, it's Ta'ir Panav, it lights up his face. And I sat there for a half hour looking at his face until I realized that it's lit up, and I see the light there, the spiritual light there, and this, just by gazing at his face and see the inner wisdom needed for leadership, along with his righteousness, his humility, and that's why the Sadiger Rebbe, that was it. He was able to become the leader. Rav Avraham Matisyahu becomes the Shtefanesht Rebbe, leader of the Shtefanesht Chassidic, and the predominant Chassidic leader in Romania for the next 65 years, until his own passing in 1933 at the age of 85. Now, just historically speaking, this is likely one of the longest lasting tenures of a Chassidic Rebbe of any kind. It's also the most influential in his region. Stories of his Hasidic leadership and history, just for its longevity. He became a living legend in his own lifetime among Romanian Jewry. Beyond Romania, it's interesting, he was not incredibly well known. Maybe a little bit in Hungary or possibly Galicia, but in Russia or Poland, he was almost unknown. He was the Romania rabbi. He was the king of Romania, of Romanian Hasidus, of the Romanian Jewish community. And that's part of the reason his story has not been given its due credit. But listen, 65 years he was at the helm of leadership. That's an incredibly long time and very influential. In Romanian Jewry, he was a legend in his own lifetime. He had thousands of followers, and he had an outsized impact on Romanian Jewry in general overall, well beyond his own court. He was renowned for his warmth, his treating everyone personally, personal warmth, personal greetings, a smile. Everyone gravitated towards him, and he was quite beloved. What's even more astounding regarding his leadership and persona is that he followed his father's approach of never saying Torah. He never said Torah at his tish, almost never. In fact, he rarely spoke altogether. It's fascinating. He was this silent tzaddik. The most distinctive feature about him was his being a respected leader over a very large Hasidic community, thousands of followers, for 65 years, and really never saying any Torah or almost anything else. It's quite a feat. He was very quiet. It was more about an inner royalty, an inner aristocracy. It was the force of his charisma, his personality, this burning yiras shamayim and love that people in his presence noted and felt. It kind of permeated the atmosphere around him. In fact, in Romania, they used to say about the silence of both him and his father, they used to cite a pasuk, I think it's in Tehillim, that they said, Ein oimer ve'ein dvarim beli nishma kailam. They don't say, there's no words, no one hears their voice, but yet, still, b'chol ha'aretz yatsa kavam, the whole land, the whole landscape, the whole community, the whole region, they're renowned u'biktsei sevel milehem, and they're very famous, all around. So, their silence didn't limit their reach at all. And his reach was quite astounding because he was one of the few figures of Hasidic history whose influence reached far beyond the confines of his specific community of followers. And this despite the fact that, like I mentioned, he didn't speak much. He definitely did not publish any svarim. He didn't openly take any public political stances, although he had some very non-mainstream political views, but he kept them pretty quiet for the most part. We'll see soon. We'll talk about that. But within Romanian Jewry, and I'm talking about Romanian Jewry at large here, not just his Hasidim, he was a leader, he was a legend, he commanded respect, reverence, and awe by large swaths of Romanian Jewry, despite them not being his Hasidim altogether, or Hasidim altogether. On one hand, on one end of the spectrum, you have the rabbinical establishment of Romania. Many of them were not Hasidim, even the ones who were, some of them were Hasidim of other rebbes, but the Rabbanim in Romania, the rabbis, had the utmost respect for him. They sought out his advice. They described his greatness in glowing terms. Many non-Hasidim went to him. And then he had on the other side of the spectrum, he had completely secular or unaffiliated Jews who loved him, who sought out his blessing. We have testimonies in memoirs written of his visits to towns on the Romanian or Moldovan countryside. He'd very often travel to visit his followers and communities where simple Jews, simple townspeople, religious and secular alike, would come out to greet him and describe him and his personality in almost mythical terms. I've read a few of these testimonies. It's quite unique. And these are documented encounters from his own lifetime. It's not some hagiographical memoir written decades later. It's actually authentic testimony. So this is something that we really know firsthand. He also kept a close group of Hasidim who were his elite personal Hasidim. They were called the Yoshvim, which was common in many Hasidic courts, especially the regal courts. And these fellas studied Torah and Shtefanesht all day long. There was close to 100 individuals at any given time, and they had more access to him, and he also funded the entire operation and all their needs. He supported the Yoshvim. His davening was part of this legendary spiritual experience. Every daily prayer of his would take a few hours. He would stand silently, completely silent, with intense concentration for several hours each day by each one of the daily prayers. People would come to watch this incredible phenomenon, all without a sound emanating from him. An eyewitness testimony regarding his Rosh Hashanah Musaf states that he stood ramrod straight for 2 hours for Shemona Esrei without moving a muscle, total focus, total control. Another avodah that many of the followers of his noted was the nanuim, the shaking, the lulav and esrog, the daled minim on Sukkos. People would watch him. He'd be completely enveloped in his talis. You couldn't see him, his body at all, his face, nothing. He was completely covered. Just the front of his hands protruded from the front of the talis, clutching the daled minim, the lulav and esrog in his hands. And he'd shake the lulav and esrog for hours. The nanum went on for hours. His hands would be sweaty. They saw his hands. They would be soaked and wet and completely soaked from the intensity of his avodah that he was doing. But miraculously, they described, these same testimonies described, that his esrog remained completely dry during this process. Now, between me and you, I don't know much about the Kabbalistic mystical significance of the Nanuim, but at least I'm aware of its existence, and surviving eyewitnesses described these special Nanuim as a sight to behold. He also secluded himself several hours each day, completely secluded, which was when he studied Torah and Kabbalah, mystical studies. If someone would come into the room, he'd make sure that all Sfarim were returned to the shelf. No one was ever permitted to see him studying. It was everything about him was mysterious. It was all a hidden avodah. It was all tznius, tsanua, quiet, humility, modest, hidden. No one quite understood it. No one questioned it. He'd always ensure that his desk was clear of any Sfarim. He didn't have any holy books lying around. It was always clear. He was also famous for his generosity. He distributed large sums of money to tzedakah, to charity, and he personally supported many individuals, causes, and institutions without fanfare. Again, everything quietly and modestly. Most were not even aware that he was dedicated personally to distributing such vast sums of money to those in need. His renown was among the general populace as well, non-Jews, and legends about his miraculous healing powers circulated among the Romanian population and the Romanian press. Many non-Jews came to seek his blessing and his prayers, and he received them warmly as well. He was known for his miraculous ability to pray for healing illness, to assist those who needed children. His fame spread far and wide as a supernatural miracle worker. That became his most famous component of his fame and ultimately his legacy. If there's any pre-war Meifsim personality, he was it. He was the pre-war Meifsim personality, because there's reasonable testimony regarding the many stories surrounding him that are actually authentic, true stories. So it's actually part and parcel of his biography is these Meifsim stories. When he traveled with his entourage, especially on special occasions, such as his annual pilgrimage to Yassi for his father's yahrzeit, there was often a detachment of Romanian police at his lodgings to keep order with the crowds who would be amassing there to seek his blessing. So every morning when he left to daven Shachris, he'd give the cops who were standing guard outside his hotel a tip. He would give them a coin as a tip to thank them for their service, some like gold coin or whatever it was. The non-Jewish police officers would switch shifts and places just to be in the spot where he'd leave the hotel in order to be the one to receive the coin from his hands, because they understood him to be a miracle worker as well. And one of the miraculous stories told about him was that he stopped a pogrom from causing any damage to the Jews of Shtefanesht. There was actually a mob on the way there that suddenly stopped and disbanded. There was once a follower of his, a follower of the Shtefaneshter, who was a fur trader who had a lucrative fur hat business. And there were 2 mild winters in Romania, and he barely sold any hats. And his supply was getting ruined in storage, and were not getting sold. He needed a cold winter quickly to be able to sell out and put his family back on financial standing. So he traveled to the Shtefaneshter for Simchas Torah. You go to the Rebbe for Yantif, and he, as is common among Jews, especially Hasidim, especially a time like Simchas Torah, he drank quite a bit. By the way, parenthetically, Shtefanesht Chassidim had quite a reputation in general of drinking quite heavily on many occasions. In case anyone wants to adopt a nice Shtefanesht custom, that's up for grabs. In fact, Shtefanesht Chassidim were sometimes criticized for this practice by their opponents, that they were regularly inebriated. In any event, while he was drunk, this Chassid was drunk, this fur hat dealer, on Simchas Torah, he started composing a gramen, a rhyme, based on the Shemini Atzeres prayer for rain, which is customarily recited on that day. Now, rain is, of course, a symbol for parnasa, for livelihood, so he related this prayer to his own woes in the fur hat business, and he composed this creative poetry based on this rain prayer for Shemini Atzeres relating to his fur hat business. So he's singing his composition rather loudly, and the Rebbe heard it and listened. Now, following Yontif, when he came to take leave of the Rebbe asked him to repeat his gramen. So at this point, he's very embarrassed. He said, I drank too much. I'm so sorry. I shouldn't have done it. It was inappropriate. He apologized. But the Rebbe just said again, please repeat your gramen. So the guy said, the Rebbe gesagt, what are you supposed to do? So he repeated it. The Rebbe then blessed him that his prayers should be answered and his business ventures should be successful again. And of course, so it was. Another chassid of the Shtefanesht had a kretschmer, a roadside inn, which was a rather common Jewish commercial activity in, well, this is Moldova, Romania, but in the Russian Pale of Settlement, it was common at the time, so I'm sure in Romania it was as well. In any event, a drunk peasant once kept on demanding more alcohol, and this chassid said, well, before you take more alcohol, you need to pay for it. You need to pay for it up front. So this drunk peasant got angry, and he said, well, you suspect that I won't pay? And he started to get violent. A fight breaks out, and it seems that in the scuffle, this guy died. So now this Nebuch Jew, who's a chassid of the Shtefanesht, is accused of murder. He's accused of murdering this fellow. So he escapes to Shtefanesht, and he cries out to his Rebbe, and he says, what should I do? I'm going to be arrested, I'm going to be caught. The Rebbe said, you go back. You go back, you'll get arrested, you'll stand trial. That's what's going to happen, because that's what you're being accused of, but everything will be all right, don't worry. Okay, so he went back. The Rebbe said, so he went back, and he turned himself in to the police, and he's arrested, he stands trial, and eventually he's acquitted. Why was he acquitted? It was based on the fact that all the witnesses to the crime were drunk at the time of the murder, and therefore their testimony was invalid. So it has an interesting ending. When the Shtefanesht passed away in 1933, he was buried in Shtefanesht, Romania. But in 1969, 36 years later, when Romania was communist, I never really got to the bottom of this story, why it happened and how it happened and what was the background. But what did happen was that the Shtefanesht was transferred from Romania to Israel. And he was taken out of communist Romania, communist Shtefanesht, and reburied in the Nachlat Yitzchak cemetery in Givatayim in 1969, alongside many other tzaddikim, like I mentioned before. We do the tours there. Lots of them from the Ruzhin Tzaddik dynasty, a lot of famous rabbis, a lot of other famous rabbanim. Allegedly, when the Shtefanesht was transferred, his body was found to be whole, which is said about, a standard item to mention regarding huge tzaddikim, but we can assume over here that it was true. So he's reburied there, and from his reburial, it took on another legend of its own, because he's a reburial from a world that was, and he's someone who was very well known in his lifetime for his yeshiyas, for his miraculous salvation, and therefore it became a pilgrimage site for prayer until this very day. Now, Avraham Matisyahu Friedman, the Shtefanesht, was childless. His beloved nephew was a fellow by the name of Nachum Friedman of Itzkan. And he was personally groomed by the Shtefanesht. He was his sister's son, to be his successor. So he was going to be the next Rebbe of Shtefanesht since he didn't have children. But unfortunately, this Nachum Friedman of Itzkan passed away just a few weeks, about a month before his elderly uncle. He was in his 50s. He had been sick for quite some time. So essentially, in 1933, first the passing of the Rebbe to be, Rebbe Nachum Friedman of Itzkan, and then a month later of the elderly Rebbe himself, the Shtefanesht dynasty came to an end. This nephew of his was handpicked by the Heilige Shtefanesht to be his successor. And in his lifetime, he even served as a kind of like junior Rebbe during his uncle's last years. Had he not passed away suddenly a month before the Shtefanesht, he would have succeeded him as the third Shtefanesht Rebbe. So it's worth delving into his biography and story for just a couple of minutes, because as far as I know, he's one of the most fascinating, unique, strange, bizarre personalities in the history of the entire Hasidic movement, and he's been completely forgotten, which is what we do to people who don't fit in the box. We forget them. So he was born, this Menachem Friedman of Itzkan, nephew of the Shtefanesht, who was supposed to be the third Shtefanesht Rebbe had he not passed away before his uncle. He was born in Shtefanesht in 1879. His mother was obviously a sister of the Shtefanesht, and she was a daughter, obviously, of the first Shtefanesht, Menachem Nochem of Shtefanesht. His father was also from the family. He was from the Bahush side of the family, so both sides were from Ruzhin. He then marries the daughter of Rabbi Yisrael Friedman of Chartkov, the famous Chartkov Rebbe, another cousin. It's also from Ruzhin. So from all sides, he's in Ruzhin. He is in the Hasidic aristocracy of his day. His father-in-law, the Chartkov Rebbe, was one of the leaders of Agudas Yisrael, and this Rabbi Menachem Friedman of Itzkan his pedigree was impeccable. When he was about 30 years old, he left Chartkov, where he was by his father-in-law, and he was hired as the rabbi of Itzkan, which is a town in Austrian Bukovina. He did not serve as a Hasidic leader. He was appointed the communal rabbi. He served as a communal rabbi, as a paisik in halacha, etc. So that already is the first thing that he's out of the box. But he was much more out of the box than that. He was completely out of the box. The box and him were like miles away in just about every conceivable way possible. He studied every general subject under the sun on his own, and was especially proficient in both Jewish and general philosophy. He actually considered himself an amateur philosopher. He knew languages. He owned all of these books. They sat on his bookshelf, and he studied them regularly. He accepted the modern world. He even attempted to write halachic responsa, which included great leniencies regarding all kinds of modern issues, such as autopsies. He crossed every possible red line. He was a public opponent of Agudas Yisrael, of which his father-in-law, the Chartkov Rebbe, who he remained close with his whole life, was one of its primary leaders and spokesmen. He published opinion pieces in Jewish newspapers, and many of them were anti the Agudas Yisrael. He considered the Agudah to be too fanatic. He was openly a Zionist. He was a religious Zionist, which is not as uncommon as it sounds, because in the Ruzhin dynasty, especially its Romanian branches, they were actually pretty Zionistic. So he wasn't that much out of the box as far as that was concerned. Bahush dynasty was Zionistic, Pashkan, Shtefanesht, Husyatin, but he was very out there. Menachem Nochem of Itzkan was very active. In 1923, he was asked by his elderly uncle, the Shtefanesht Rebbe, to move back to Shtefanesht so that he can prepare him to assume the mantle of leadership of the Shtefanesht Chassidic after his passing. And while the next decade, the next 10 years of his life until he passed away, there he served as the junior Rebbe. He received kvitlach from the Chassidim. He gave advice and brachas. He also served as the head of the local Keren HaYesod branch of the Zionist movement. And its offices, the offices of the Keren HaYesod, were in the Shtefanesht court. They were in the Chutzner. In his office, in the Keren HaYesod office, where Rabbi Menachem Friedman of Itzkan, the future Shtefanesht Rebbe, sat in the court of his uncle, above his desk was a picture of Theodor Herzl. Most of the Shtefanesht Chassidim living in Shtefanesht were openly Zionistic. What's even more fascinating than all of this, if that's even possible, is that at this time he also begins writing Sfarim, Hebrew Sfarim on philosophy. Now these Sfarim were apologetics. They were establishing a synthesis between Torah and philosophy. He wanted to prove that Torah and philosophy were in complete harmony. That was the theme of all of his Sfarim. He wrote a philosophical commentary on Pirkei Avos. Then he wrote on dreams. He wrote Al Chaloim Upisroinon, on dreams and their interpretation. Very philosophical work. He then wrote another sefer called Al Ha'emes V'Al Sheker, on truth and falsehood. Very abstract. Then he wrote, he gets even more daring as his life goes on. He wrote Al Hayofi, on beauty, aesthetics and beauty. And his last one, got to be the best one, on man, Al Ha'adam, on man. This is so unprecedented in the Hasidic world that it's nothing short of astounding. And all this time, Rabbi Nachum of Yitzkan dresses like a Rebbe, looks like a Rebbe, studies Torah all day, sits on the Bezdin of Shtefanesht, is being groomed to succeed the Shtefaneshter as the next Shtefaneshter Rebbe. He's a tzaddik. He didn't compromise one iota of his religious ideals and lifestyle. He's not excommunicated. He maintains good relationships with his famous family members. It's unbelievable. Anyone else who didn't have his pedigree in Yichus would have been banned as a heretic and considered secular. This is quite a story. He suffered from poor health. He passed away at the age of 53, only a month before his illustrious uncle, so he never succeeded him. His wife did survive the Holocaust. She passed away in 1963 in Paris, and she's buried in the Shtefanesht section in the Nachlat Yitzchak Cemetery in Givatayim. Rabbi Nachum's only child was his daughter Feiga, and she and her husband and their child were killed by the Nazis in the Holocaust. It's a fascinating story. Now, I want to mention, just to end off here, we said the Shtefanesht dynasty ends in 1933 because the Heilige Shtefanesht of Avraham Matisyahu Friedman passes away in 1933 with no children, no succession. It ends suddenly. No more Shtefanesht. That's it. No more Shtefanesht. So I want to mention 4 sort of continuations of Shtefanesht, or at least the Shtefanesht legacy, despite him not having any direct descendants or successors. Number 1, the rabbi of the town of Shtefanesht at the time of the Shtefanesht Rebbe's passing was a fellow by the name of Rabbi Yosef Breyer. I'm sure most listeners are familiar with the name of the Breyer family and their close affiliation with the Ruzhin dynasty. Now, most associate them with the Bayan branch of the dynasty. Why? Because the current Bayana Rebbe is Reb Nachum Dov Breyer, and he's the Bayana Rebbe, right? So his grandfather was this Rabbi Yosef Breyer. So the current Bayana Rebbe is a grandson of the rabbi of Shtefanesht at the time of the Shtefanesht Rebbe's passing. This Rabbi Yosef Breyer, who grew up in a Hasidic family, was a follower of the different Ruzhin Rebbes, a very prominent Ruzhin Sadiger family. He's appointed the rabbi of Shtefanesht in 1928. He was a very big, prominent Talmud Chacham and very famous rabbinical leader. And he becomes the rabbi of Shtefanesht in 1928. And he was a close follower of the elderly Shtefanesht Rebbe. The Rabbi Yosef Breyer sat next to the Rebbe at the Tish. He was on the Bezdin of the town together with this Rabbi Nachum of Yitzkan that I mentioned. Rabbi Yosef Breyer was also the Chazan in Shtefanesht on Yom Noraim. Following the Rebbe's passing in 1933, Rabbi Yosef Breyer established a yeshiva in Shtefanesht in the Rebbe's memory. It was named Beis Avraham Shtefanesht. And Rabbi Yosef Breyer personally delivered the shiurim, and it actually emerged in the last years before the war as one of the more prominent yeshivas in Romania. One of the students in this yeshiva was arguably the most famous chassid of the Shtefanesht Rebbe, Reb Chaim Zanvil Abramovich, the Ribnitzer Rebbe. He learned in this yeshiva. This yeshiva flourished until the Holocaust. Rev Breyer survived the Holocaust in Romania and immigrated with his family to the United States in 1947. His son was a very famous professor, Menachem Breyer, married the daughter of the Bayana Rebbe in New York, and he was a professor at Yeshiva University for many years, and his son is the current Bayana Rebbe. So I always felt that Bayan, and the Bayana Hasidus today, the Bayana dynasty, the Bayana community today, is somewhat a continuation of Shtefanesht as well. In addition to the fact that, of course, the yeshiva in the town was named for him, and it flourished until the Holocaust. That's number 1. Number 2, there was a descendant of the Trisk dynasty, which is a branch of Chernobyl, named Menachem Nochem Margolius. And he resided in Iasi, in Romania, and was a major figure in the local Shtefanesht Klois in Iasi. In Iasi was a lot of Shtefanesht Chassidim. So the Shtefanesht Klois in Iasi was a very prominent shul. The Shtefanesht Chassidim in Iasi decided to crown him and name him the Shtefanesht Rebbe. So he sort of served in that capacity until until the Holocaust. Also, most Shtefanesht Chassidim in Romania went to another local branch of the Ruzhin dynasty, Pashkan, which was also in Romania, which was then headed by Matisyahu Friedman of Pashkan, who came from the Bohush dynasty, which is another branch of Ruzhin. And there's a lot in common between all these Ruzhin branches, and especially the Romanian ones. And so therefore the Shtefanesht Chassidim kind of merged into Pashkan. That's number 2. Number 3, this is perhaps the most famous element of the Shtefanesht legacy. His close chassid was Reb Chaim Zanfel Abramovich, who I mentioned before, the Rebnitzer Rebbe. So the Rebnitzer Rebbe was sort of a continuation, and because he was a famous chassid and follower of the Shtefanesht Rebbe that lived until recently, relatively, till about 30 years ago. Ironically, unfortunately, he, like his Rebbe, also never had children. Now, for some reason, I had recalled seeing somewhere that the Skalena Rebbe, Eliezer Zushia, Portugal, was also a follower of the Stefaneshter. But then I looked it up again when I was preparing for this podcast, and it seems that he was a chassid of Bohush. So I guess I was wrong, unless someone else can point me to a source that would indicate that he also had a relationship with the Stefaneshter. Number 4, following his reburial in Israel in 1969, the Shtefaneshter had a resurgence of his memory. There are now shuls and koilos named for him. There's big money-making operations with segulas and miracles. There's an entire industry by now, books being published. So as far as I know, Shtefanesht is alive and well in that respect. So this was the story of Shtefanesht. This is Yehuda Geber with Jewish History Soundbites. You can reach me at yehuda@yehudageber.com. For questions, comments, sources, tours, trips, sponsorships, and lectures, you can subscribe to Jewish History Soundbites on your favorite podcast platform, and I hope you enjoyed.